Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that demands that I remove the lock from my gate. I've always been a pretty easygoing person, and I thought I knew how to deal with all sorts of neighborly dramas. I was no stranger to property disputes or the complexities of dealing with people who believe their convenience should outweigh everyone else's rights. But I never expected the homeowners association near my acreage to try something as absurd as dictating how I secure my own land. Looking back on everything now, I still can't believe how ridiculous it all became. Let me start from the beginning, because I promise you, this story only gets more mind-boggling as it goes along. I own about 20 acres of farmland on the outskirts of a residential community. It's not a fancy farm. I don't have a sweeping veranda or a picturesque barn everyone wants to take family photos in front of. I raise a few goats, have a small orchard of apple trees, and grow seasonal vegetables. My parents purchased the land decades ago but never developed it beyond a humble house, a small barn, and a few pens for animals. When my father passed away, I inherited the property. Keeping it was a no-brainer for me. I value the calm, the open space, and the connection to the simpler aspects of living off the land. I run a modest business selling goat milk, goat cheese, apples, and whatever vegetables I can harvest throughout the year. It's nothing that would make me wealthy, but it's enough to keep me fed, pay my bills, and maintain the property. The land is technically adjacent to a neighborhood with a homeowners association that was formed around 15 years ago. The houses there are neat, new, and in many ways the total opposite of my rustic old homestead. Though the boundaries of that association do not include my acreage, the farmland is physically next to a long stretch of houses that sit on far smaller lots. A tall chain-link fence separates me from the community, and my main driveway cuts through one corner of the development. Because of that, I have a gate at the end of my long driveway, which ensures that any visitors or deliveries have to wait for me to open up or use a code if I provide them with one. One of my neighbors, a man named Clay, is the president of that homeowners association. He introduced himself to me right after he assumed the leadership role. At the time, Clay seemed polite, but also gave off a vibe of wanting to keep everything in perfect order. He's the kind of person who demands that everyone's lawn be exactly 2.5 inches high, that no flower pots deviate from the sanctioned color scheme, and that all holiday decorations come down on a strict schedule. I paid little attention to his rules since my property is not beholden to the association. Occasionally, he'd knock on my door to alert me about things like excess weeds too close to the fence line or tree branches drifting into the airspace of the HOA. I once tried to be friendly and told him I'd handle the small issues on my side, but I also politely reminded him that, as a property outside their domain, I couldn't be forced to adhere to HOA statutes. That was the first time I saw the muscle in his jaw clench. He smiled, nodded, and walked away. That was about 3 years ago. At first, the tension between us was mild, but as the months passed, I started hearing from other folks in the neighborhood that Clay wanted to see my farmland put to better use. He believed, as rumor had it, that my property made the area look too rural and unpolished. At an association meeting, I was told, by a sympathetic neighbor named Suzanne, that Clay floated the idea of converting part of my land into green space for the community, completely ignoring that it was private land I actually used. I didn't attend those meetings, but Suzanne would sometimes fill me in on the gist. I usually just shook my head in amusement. Fast forward to last fall. Things took a turn when Clay decided he wanted the far back portion of my orchard to be accessible for an HOA-sponsored event. Apparently, they wanted to hold some sort of four-wheeler activity for the teenagers in the neighborhood. I'm not anti-youth, but I have orchard rows and a wide drainage ditch in the far corner that can be dangerous if people are recklessly driving. Not to mention, it's my liability. If someone flipped an ATV on my property, I'd be at risk. So, in no uncertain terms, I told Clay I was not open to the idea. I assumed that was the end of it. But Clay, as I would soon find out, had no intention of taking no for an answer. A couple of weeks later, I returned from running errands in town to find a note taped to my front gate. It was printed on official association letterhead and demanded that I remove the padlock from my gate because it allegedly infringed on community safety and emergency access. The letter also stated that the HOA needed to be able to drive an ATV through my fields in case of certain events, and insisted that I provide them with either the gate code or remove the entire lock mechanism altogether. I could hardly believe what I was reading. This was my private property. I was not in the HOA. They had absolutely zero authority over my land. I phoned Clay as soon as I read the note. He was curt, basically telling me that I could take it up with the association board if I disagreed. Of course, this struck me as nonsensical. In my mind, it was as simple as, you don't own my property, and you don't get to impose your rules on me. The next day, I had a visit from Suzanne, who was part of the HOA board in a lower capacity. She quietly confided that Clay had convinced a majority of the board that my farm was considered an easement for the sake of the local area's drainage system. He apparently argued that meant they had a legal right to pass through if they needed. Suzanne said she was not convinced but had been outvoted in a recent meeting. She also said she heard Clay mention that if I refused to comply, the HOA might pursue legal action to force me to remove or unlock my gate. This was getting more serious than I expected, so I decided to consult a lawyer. My attorney, Dominic, was a no-nonsense guy. He was familiar with property disputes and pretty quickly told me I was in the clear. My land was not within the association boundaries, and there was no recorded easement for them on my deed. The only easement was for a drainage canal that a local utility company maintained. Dominic explained that a private homeowners association had no business forcing me to remove a lock. However, it was possible they could pull out all sorts of nuisance tactics if I didn't respond properly. Before I even had a chance to draft a formal response, Clay escalated matters by sending me a violation letter, complete with a fine, for failing to comply with the HOA regulation about gate locks. Again, it was on their official letterhead. The letter threatened to continue imposing fines until I removed the lock. It was absurd. They even spelled out an amount and said that if I didn't pay by a certain date, they would place a lien on my property. Obviously, they had zero authority to do that. But it made me mad that they would so blatantly bully me in this manner. A part of me considered ignoring the letters, but ignoring them could cause more trouble down the road, especially if Clay tried to spread rumors or do something underhanded with the local authorities. So I had Dominic draft a cease and desist letter. We basically told them to stop harassing me, that they had no jurisdiction and any further action from them would be considered an act of trespass and harassment. We sent the letter via certified mail to the HOA. Less than a week later, Clay showed up at my gate, accompanied by 2 other board members. One of them, a tall man named Gerald, wore an expression I could only describe as smug confidence. Clay pulled out a camera and started taking pictures of my locked gate. He then read from what sounded like a script saying, "We, as representatives of the local homeowners association, are documenting this violation to further substantiate our claims." I tried to reason with them, telling them politely but firmly that they were trespassing. Clay retorted that they were standing on an association-approved sidewalk, which basically meant he was a foot away from the boundary line. I told him to leave, but he continued with his routine, claiming, "If you don't remove that lock, we'll see you in court." Then they marched away with Gerald filming me on his phone. Soon after that bizarre showdown, I learned that the HOA had filed a lawsuit. They were seeking a legal order to have the lock removed and to fine me for not complying with rules that supposedly impacted their neighborhood. I was both furious and baffled. At this point, I was certain we would prevail. My lawyer, Dominic, assured me we had the law on our side, but I'll admit, the idea of going to court was daunting and infuriating. They were essentially wasting my time and money over something so patently ridiculous. As all of this was unfolding, a separate issue brewed in the background. Local kids had started sneaking onto my property after dark to ride ATVs. I never caught them red-handed, but I would hear the engines late at night, see fresh tire tracks in the morning, and occasionally spot trash near the orchard. At first, I thought it was random trespassers, but one evening, I recognized one of the kids. He was definitely from the HOA neighborhood, probably around 16 or 17 years old. He sped off when he saw my truck's headlights approaching. I was frustrated, not because I hated fun, but because riding motorized vehicles in an orchard can be dangerous. And from a liability standpoint, I was uneasy about uninvited people zipping around in the dark. So, I reinforced my fence on the far side where I suspected they were sneaking in. I also posted no trespassing signs in multiple places. Of course, the HOA might not have been behind these kids' actions, but the fact remained that my farmland was a tempting open space for bored teenagers on ATVs. Meanwhile, the upcoming court date loomed. My lawyer compiled a robust defense. Dominic found all the property records proving no HOA obligations, and also found a county record explicitly stating that there was no public easement across my land. He took pictures of the orchard, the drainage canal, and the gate. We had the official deed going back to when my parents purchased the property many years ago, which showed no mention of an HOA anywhere. The association's claim was that they needed emergency access for community vehicles, but that argument held no water since the county had never documented my land as such. Dominic was confident the association's case was built on toothpicks. While preparing for court, I learned from Suzanne that Clay's real motive was to create a new access point for an ATV path that was being planned for the neighborhood's recreational area. The association apparently wanted to link their existing trail to a path that ran near the creek on the other side of my orchard. By forcibly removing my lock, they could come and go freely through my property. Suzanne felt it was wrong, but she was outnumbered by the rest of the board members who thought it would be an exciting addition to their community amenities. Essentially, they wanted my orchard to serve as a convenient throughway, ignoring that it was private farmland with livestock, equipment, and potential hazards. The arrogance of it all made my blood boil. Things kept escalating. A few days before the court hearing, someone vandalized one of my orchard fences. Several strands of barbed wire were cut clean through at a corner post. My best guess is that it was the same teenagers. I doubt Clay himself would stoop that low, though it wouldn't surprise me if he encouraged them by complaining that I was an obstacle. I reported the vandalism to the local sheriff's department, explaining that I suspected the trespassing kids. The deputy took my statement and recommended I install motion-activated cameras to document any future incidents. I spent half a day patching the fence and putting up cameras. That's time I should have spent tending to my goats and preparing my produce stand for the upcoming harvest season. It was maddening to realize how this unnecessary drama was undermining the livelihood I built. Soon enough, the court date arrived. I showed up with Dominic, dressed in my best attempt at formal attire. Black slacks, a white-collared shirt, and a blazer I'd only worn once before. Clay walked in with Gerald and a small entourage of 4 other board members. They seemed confident, wearing matching ties, carrying binders, and occasionally whispering among themselves. The hearing wasn't set to be particularly lengthy, as these disputes often rely on straightforward property law. The judge, an older gentleman with a calm but authoritative presence, asked the HOA to state their case. Their attorney argued that my locked gate obstructed the association's right to an easement on my property for community safety. He also mentioned that the lock could hamper emergency service vehicles. Dominic calmly presented the official deed, the county records, and a statement from the local fire department clarifying that my farmland was not an essential access route and that any emergency vehicles could reach me via the main road if needed. We also showed that the only official easement was for the utility company's drainage canal, for which I always provided access if they needed to maintain the ditch. There was no mention in any document about giving the HOA access for recreational vehicles. Partway through the proceedings, the judge asked the HOA to present any official documentation that established their right to demand I remove the lock. Their attorney began flipping through pages, clearly unable to find anything concrete. Clay tried to interject, insisting that the neighborhood was designed with the understanding that farmland might be developed or utilized. The judge wasn't having it. He asked for actual legal documents, not assumptions. When none were produced, the judge quickly realized how baseless their lawsuit was. The final blow to their case was when Dominic handed over a copy of the letter the HOA had sent me, threatening fines and liens. The judge read it, raised an eyebrow, and said, "So, you threatened a lien on a property that you have no actual authority over?" You could see the color drain from Clay's face. That moment felt like justice was about to be served. After reviewing everything, the judge dismissed their lawsuit and indicated that I could seek damages for legal fees. Dominic had already prepared a countersuit to recoup my attorney costs. The judge granted that too, meaning the HOA had to pay for my legal expenses. I walked out of that courtroom relieved, but also incredibly annoyed that it ever got that far in the first place. Clay and Gerald avoided eye contact as we passed them in the hallway. Their attorney scurried off without so much as a nod. I considered the matter settled, but part of me worried about potential retaliation. People like Clay don't typically back down quietly. In the weeks following the court's decision, I did notice a shift in how the neighborhood kids behaved. My motion cameras captured a few glimpses of them at the far edge of my orchard, apparently searching for ways in, but quickly backing off when they saw the new signs and cameras. I suspect the news of the court ruling spread, and maybe Clay realized he'd be in deep trouble if more vandalism or trespassing occurred. I didn't want to push further. I felt satisfied that the legal process had affirmed my rights. Plus, the HOA had to reimburse me for Dominic's fees, which was a modest sum, but enough to cover the cost of those new cameras and fence repairs. It felt like a small victory. Just when I thought that was the end of my saga, a new subplot emerged. I discovered that the County Farmland Preservation Office was investigating a complaint about my orchard. Apparently, a letter had been sent claiming I was mismanaging pesticide usage and contaminating neighborhood gardens. I was appalled. My orchard is organic. I use no synthetic pesticides, and I pride myself on eco-friendly methods. I had the documentation to prove it. The Preservation Office scheduled an inspection, and I cooperated fully. They tested my soil, checked my records for organic certifications, and found no issues. The inspector even complimented me on my natural pest control methods, like encouraging beneficial insects and using homemade neem oil sprays. The complaint was deemed unfounded and closed, but I had no doubt in my mind that someone in the HOA, possibly Clay or Gerald, had orchestrated that complaint. Their plan backfired, though. Now I have official statements confirming my orchard practices are perfectly safe and clean. As if that weren't enough to keep the drama high, about a month after the pesticide complaint, a small group of neighbors from the HOA, excluding Clay and Gerald, approached me politely one afternoon. Suzanne was among them, along with two elderly residents named Everett and Marlene. They explained that they felt ashamed of the association's bullying tactics. Everett, who had lived in the area for years, said he remembered when my parents first bought the farm. He apologized on behalf of the older neighbors who never wanted any trouble. They also mentioned that Clay's presidency was up for re-election soon, and there was a growing movement among the community members to replace him with someone more reasonable. They asked if I would be open to having a friendly relationship with the HOA if Clay was voted out. I told them I'd be willing to be a good neighbor, as I always had been, as long as they respected my property rights and communicated with me directly if they had concerns. I was touched they came to me in person. It showed me not everyone in that neighborhood shared Clay's entitled mindset. Simultaneously, I began dealing with a separate predicament, an ongoing coyote problem. Several coyotes had started circling my goat pens at night, and though they'd never managed to harm any of my animals, I had to be extra vigilant. I reinforced the perimeter and set up additional motion lights. I mention this because it was a reminder to me of why I keep my gates locked in the first place. When you have livestock, you're constantly trying to protect them from both predators and, unfortunately, irresponsible humans. One night, I was awakened by the bleating of my goats and saw a coyote dashing away under the moonlight. I spent a good portion of the early morning hours patrolling the fence line. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I was grateful my gates were locked and my security measures were working. The last thing I needed was for the HOA to have free rein to come tearing through on ATVs, scaring my animals and leaving me vulnerable to even more chaos. On a lighter note, the orchard was thriving. My apple trees were in peak production that year, and my vegetable patch yielded a wonderful harvest of tomatoes, peppers, and squash. My goat cheese business was slowly expanding. Local shops started inquiring if I could supply them regularly. Amid all the turmoil, there were bright spots reminding me that holding on to this land was truly worth it. I didn't want to take for granted the sweet moments of success among the bitterness of petty neighborhood politics. I even received a call from an acquaintance at a local farmers cooperative, praising my goat cheese and offering to feature it at a regional food festival. Sure enough, as the months rolled on, I watched from a distance as the HOA internal conflicts heated up. Suzanne mentioned that more board members began questioning Clay's leadership after he lost that lawsuit to me. Some of the neighbors were outraged that their dues were being used to pay my legal fees. They also weren't thrilled about the negative reputation the association was getting in the broader community. By the time their annual meeting arrived, there was a push to elect new leadership. Suzanne told me with some glee that Clay was ousted. The new president, a younger father named Matthew, promised to repair the association's image and focus on building healthy relationships with everyone in the vicinity, including those who weren't official members. In the weeks following that vote, I received a letter from the new HOA president. It was courteous, congratulating me on the orchard's success and stating that they had no intention of interfering with my property. They also offered to open a dialogue if I ever wanted to host community farm tours or educational visits for children. It was a marked shift in tone and approach. Part of me wanted to be done with them altogether, but I also recognized that forging a decent relationship with these neighbors could be beneficial in the long run. I responded that I was open to future possibilities if everything was done through proper channels. I made clear, however, that my property was private and any proposed activity would have to be scheduled and approved by me, and only me, no exceptions. Meanwhile, Clay disappeared from the neighborhood rumor mill for a little while. Gerald, however, tried to make some waves by complaining about excessive farm odors wafting into the neighborhood on windy days. This time, the new HOA leadership didn't back him up. They recognized it was just standard farmland smell. You live near livestock, you deal with a little barnyard aroma every now and then. Nothing about that was illegal or out of compliance with county ordinances. The final time Gerald raised the issue at a public board meeting, he was basically told to live with it or move. That's what Suzanne told me anyway, and I nearly laughed myself silly. In a sense, that was the best possible punishment for Gerald: social rejection from the very group he tried to manipulate into harassing me. Knowing that his neighbors were tired of his nonsense was better than any formal penalty a court could have given him. After that, things settled down. My orchard thrived, my goats were healthy, and I only occasionally saw the local kids riding their ATVs on designated trails well away from my fence line. Several months later, I did see Clay in passing at a local hardware store. He avoided my gaze, quickly ducking down an aisle. I suppose it's embarrassing to be the person who lost a frivolous lawsuit and forced your community to foot the bill. I imagine he doesn't have the warmest of receptions at neighborhood events these days. Then again, I can't say I feel sorry for him. As all this quieted, I made a conscious decision to forgive but not forget. Lawsuits are stressful, and I still bristle a bit when I think about all the threats and intimidation they put me through. But I've tried not to dwell on negative energy. My orchard remains locked. I still have my padlock secure. The motion cameras keep rolling, just in case. Yet my business is flourishing, and I take pride in knowing I stood up for my property rights. In a way, the entire ordeal reminded me how important it is to fight back when someone tries to stomp on your boundaries. That, and how crucial it is to have a knowledgeable lawyer in your corner when self-appointed authorities attempt to boss you around without real legal standing. The local farmland preservation office even asked me to speak at a small seminar about organic orchard management and dealing with local governments. I found myself in front of a modest group of about 15 farmers and property owners, sharing my experience of how quickly an overzealous neighbor or association can try to claim rights they don't have. It felt good to spread awareness, ensuring others won't be caught off guard if they face a similar situation. The main message I gave was simple: know your property rights, document everything, and never let someone bully you into giving up your land's integrity. From time to time, I reflect on how petty Clay's attempts were. He wanted to drive ATVs through my fields. He was determined to turn my orchard into a thoroughfare for the neighborhood. But once the matter reached a real legal setting, the fragility of his argument was exposed. Justice prevailed, and the HOA ended up paying my legal costs. That's the best ending I could have hoped for, short of them leaving me alone entirely from the start. There's one small epilogue worth mentioning. About a year after the lawsuit, the new HOA president, Matthew, reached out to me with a sincere proposition. He asked if I'd be willing to host a small orchard tour for residents, mainly children, as part of an educational program about local agriculture. I thought it over for a while. My initial reaction was to say, absolutely not, given all I'd been through. But after discussing it with Suzanne, who was helping Matthew plan the event, I realized this was a chance to build something positive. I set a few firm conditions. The HOA would provide liability waivers, the group would remain in designated areas, and no motorized vehicles were allowed beyond my front parking area. Matthew agreed wholeheartedly. When the tour day arrived, about a dozen families came. The kids were wide-eyed, excited to see the goats and sample fresh apples. I guided them through a small section of the orchard, explaining how I manage pests naturally, how pollination works, and what it takes to grow healthy fruit trees. The group was respectful and left the property in pristine condition. In the end, they handed me a handmade thank you card and some homemade pastries from the neighborhood bakers. It was a genuinely pleasant experience that showed me not everyone in that HOA was a clone of Clay. There were good folks there who simply wanted a sense of community. The next day, I found a basket of fresh bread and jam on my doorstep labeled, "From the neighborhood that's grateful for your orchard." Moments like that reminded me that cooperation can bloom even after a tough conflict. as long as both sides genuinely want to make it work. I still keep my land locked, though. I don't believe for a second that I should compromise on my right to secure my property. The orchard is more than just a business venture. It's part of my heritage, part of my life's work, something my parents spent decades cultivating. If letting a homeowners association run roughshod over it to drive ATVs was the alternative, I'm more than happy to have won that legal battle, once and for all. Ultimately, this entire saga taught me a few valuable lessons about standing up for myself, about how petty and entitled certain individuals can be, and about the surprising ways people may try to manipulate property laws for their convenience. It also reminded me that for every Clay, there's a Suzanne or Matthew, people who genuinely want to live harmoniously and aren't interested in trampling on someone else's rights. My orchard gates remain locked, the new HOA management has accepted it, and life goes on. The goats graze, the apples grow, and the sweet hum of farm life carries me forward, thankful that I can continue doing what I love without unwarranted interference. Friends, thank you. See you soon.